So yeah, thanks for coming along today and having a listen. First of all, yeah, this is a collaboration, a review with a large number of people on the screen, representing and discussing various parts of small-scale fisheries and coastal transitions across Southeast Asia. So touch on what I'll briefly talk about today, just some definitions and objectives, background of the study, tiny bit of overview of the small-scale fisheries context in Southeast Asia, looking at some of the details of the changes that small-scale fisheries have faced in the last few years, looking at then some of the key maritime zone developments that are affecting small-scale fisheries in the region. So going through aquaculture, coastal reclamation and manufacturing in coastal zones, coastal tourism, and then a discussion of some of the key sorts of cross-cutting themes that emerged from the review, namely commodification, environmental degradation, and the concept of coastal squeeze. So briefly, the idea of the paper was motivated partly by the extensive literature on land-based agrarian change in Southeast Asia, or terrestrial change. So this stream of work has shown the diverse pathways by which small-scale farming livelihoods are transformed by globalisation to adopt more market-oriented livelihoods, off-farm livelihoods, and livelihoods with greater levels of mobility, moving to urban and peri-urban spaces. In coastal zones in Southeast Asia, there's a lot of work that remains focused on small-scale fisheries and the governance of small-scale fisheries, and less attention paid to how these fisheries are embedded within wider processes of political and economic change. And where they do focus on these processes of change, they tend to focus on case studies in specific locations. So with this study, we aim to review these sorts of processes at a larger Southeast Asian scale. We use small-scale fisheries-based livelihoods as a point of focus, showing how these livelihoods are intersecting with wider transformations in maritime zone developments, such as aquaculture, tourism, manufacturing, and wage labour. While small-scale fisheries have long been market-oriented and have also been combined with other sorts of livelihood activities, such as farming, the scale and pace of newer forms of coastal transformations is increasing rapidly. So each author provided assessments of each of the 10 maritime states of Southeast Asia, and then we critically reviewed them collaboratively to identify some of the most dominant and noteworthy forms of sectoral changes. There's obviously a great diversity of forms of coastal change, many of which aren't considered here, including agriculture, oil palm, and so on. This is a selective overview. So to touch on the resource use and governance context, I'm sure much of this will be familiar to most people here, but in terms of fisheries and marine resource use, Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam are particularly significant in terms of fisheries and aquaculture production. Then you've also got other states that have different sorts of roles, for example, in trade, the city-state of Singapore, and then other smaller countries like Timor-Leste and Brunei, so a fair bit of diversity there. In terms of governance of the coastal zone, again, there's a large varieties of actors and organisations and institutions involved in the governance of small-scale fisheries and coastal zones. But one sort of commonality that we have seen in the past couple of decades is a widespread intensification of various forms of monitoring and surveillance. With regard to small-scale fisheries in particular, we've seen widespread types of intensification. So this can be, for example, using new sorts of technologies to catch fish, using or catching different species of fish for new markets that may have emerged, such as new species of sea cucumber that are emerging as markets in East Asia, or new types of reef fish. And so with this widespread intensification, new technologies, new markets, and so on, we've also seen significant levels of resource declines, which are impacting small-scale fishery livelihoods. And of course, large-scale industrial fisheries are probably primarily responsible for these fish resource declines, of course. And so what we see now is very widespread documentation of small-scale fishers that fish further distances, longer periods of time, catching smaller numbers of fish and catching physically smaller specimens of fish. And this has been documented across all countries in Southeast Asia, even where industrial fisheries began later, such as Myanmar from the 1980s. We've still seen massive declines, up to 90%, for example, in some particular places. So obviously these fish declines have impacts on small-scale fishing livelihoods. However, small-scale fisheries really still remains important, for example, as a buffering strategy or as a component of a wider livelihood portfolio, or for those with lower levels of education. Labour mobility is very important for many small-scale fisheries, and so while this has been pretty well recognised and acknowledged for some of the indigenous Sama Bajau groups, for example, there's other groups which have also practiced seasonal migration, which sometimes leads to permanent relocation. However, another key trend that we found was that labour mobility is increasingly being challenged, for example, through conservation, introduction of marine protected areas, the intensification of transboundary border controls, and generally increased levels of competition. So in terms of how they interact with some key maritime zone developments, aquaculture is the first one we looked at. So shrimp is probably the most documented and most significant in some ways form of aquaculture, and this has a range of interactions with small-scale fishing livelihoods. So shrimp farms historically has been very closely associated with clearing of mangroves. So mangroves have been cleared and converted into shrimp ponds. However, this has slowed in recent times, and mangroves, of course, are an important nursery area for fish. Farmland along the coasts has been transformed into fish ponds towards aquaculture. So some fisher farmers have been able to transfer full-time into shrimp farming. Others with less or lower levels of land ownership or no land ownership haven't been able to do so. There's the practice of catching what's called trash fish, which are basically, low, lots of juvenile species and large numbers of small fish and juvenile fish to turn into fish feed. And this obviously impacts small-scale fisheries productivity as well. And then there's seafood processing plants. So, for example, in Thailand, which has large numbers of seafood processing factories, shrimp largely, which employs many poorer migrants, mostly from Myanmar. Seaweed is another really significant form of aquaculture. It's concentrated in Indonesia and the Philippines. Largely exported to China, the EU, North America, and it's one of these substances that's used in a range of diverse ways. So from the food, cosmetic, and pharmaceutical industries, for example. Seaweed farming often forms part of a household diversification strategy. So sometimes small-scale fishers will have a plot of seaweed while continuing to fish. Other times they'll pivot entirely to seaweed farming. However, seaweed has been shown to be quite vulnerable to shocks, particular certain diseases, typhoons, and price declines. Then there's high-value marine fish, such as groupers and barramundi, which are targeted specifically by many countries in Southeast Asia for expansion. This has similar problems to do with the trash fish that are used for fish feed, and it also generates water pollution. And then there's mollusks such as oysters and mussels, which is prevalent in some parts of Thailand and Vietnam. This is much more ecologically friendly than marine fish forms of aquaculture, for example, but there's been a range of struggles over coastal access that have also been documented. Turn to coastal land reclamation. Singapore is the exemplar of this process, where land reclamation began in 1822, and Singapore is now 25% larger since then. This is driven largely by potential for real estate and rapid population growth. The main impacts for small-scale fisheries are that coastal fishing methods such as beach seines, which are nets hauled in from the beach, and access to boat storage facilities have been key problems, and there's currently only one small wharf for small-scale fishers remaining in Singapore. Currently, Indonesia and the Philippines serve as key zones for land reclamation. In Indonesia alone, there's more than 700,000 fishers and aquaculture farmers estimated to be affected by various projects. Land reclamation is most commonly associated with megacities such as Jakarta and Manila, but it's also frequently used in other parts of these countries, such as more remote municipalities of the Philippines, such as this place, Coron, the top photo, in Palawan, where it can provide a new source of valuable real estate. And again, beach access is a key issue for small-scale fishers. Then another issue, a lot of the sand that's used for the land reclamation for Singapore, for example, comes from other parts of Southeast Asia, especially Cambodia, Vietnam and Myanmar. The impacts of sand mining have been well documented and include ecological damage and various livelihood impacts, produces very few jobs. Another issue is we've seen widespread introduction of manufacturing or various forms of special economic zones. Many of these are located in coastal zones to increase connectivity. Particularly, we've seen a lot of investment from China in Asian countries in recent years in particular. In Cambodia, these coastal SEZs have provided large numbers of jobs, particularly for women who have left fishing and farming villages. These SEZs provide relatively secure jobs that are well paid, and they have experienced less workplace harassment and the ability to provide remittances back to rural families. However, there's plenty of other cases where new forms of economic activity along the coasts have resulted in negative impacts for households. For example, parts of Myanmar, where oil and gas development, ports and special economic zones has resulted in pretty well documented forms of coastal grabbing. Coastal tourism is promoted by many governments in the region. It's often seen as something that's more environmentally sustainable than fishing and able to generate more income. So Thailand and Malaysia are the most popular locations in Southeast Asia, but Philippines, Indonesia and Vietnam have also increased rapidly. Arrivals from China in recent years particularly have surged. And coastal tourism, up until recently, is really a very significant part of the tourism in these countries, from scuba diving to beach type tourism, backpackers, ecotourism to high-end luxury resorts. And although it's seen as more environmentally sustainable, lots of unplanned tourism results in sewage and pollution, which is well documented in Thailand and Malaysia. In the Philippines, the top tourism island, Boracay, was shut down by President Duterte in 2018 for 6 months. Fishers can sometimes transition completely into tourism livelihoods, so they convert fishing boats into tourism boats or supplement it through selling local products or high-value seafood to tourism restaurants, for example. So it certainly has brought in a lot of incomes and new forms of employment. In other cases, when coastal beachfront land value increases, there's pressure for local fishing communities who've got weak land tenure to be marginalised and or evicted. And it's also generated, in some places, tensions between the tourism and the fishing sectors, for example, when marine protected areas are implemented with the main goal of increasing tourism revenue. There's also quite a few examples where fishing communities have transformed into locations for sex tourism. COVID-19 has obviously had major impacts for fishers who sell products to tourists, whether that's high-value seafood or tour guides. Fishers have sold or converted their fishing boats, now find it difficult to go back to fishing while others have been able to. So here I'll just touch on some of the cross-cutting themes that consistently emerged across the different sectors and the region. So firstly, commodification. So small-scale fisheries have long been subject to market dynamics. Strengthening demand and new technologies have allowed new products to be targeted. Governance of fisheries is now frequently done through market-based measures. So for example, there's the IUU trade measures in illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, IUU trade measures from the EU, which has prevented many exports from countries in Southeast Asia from exporting to the EU, and this has had flow-on effects for many small-scale fisheries. And in general, coastal livelihoods are now increasingly about securing value through the production of secondary products, such as migrating for wage labour opportunities in factories, or through the marketisation of the natural landscape for tourism. And while some households have been able to take advantage of this increased commodification through more secure wage labour jobs that can contribute to remittances, or through better access to new sorts of markets, in other cases, this transformation has resulted in more precarious and insecure labour, reflecting, of course, the differentiated outcomes of economic change more generally. The underlying trajectory, though, of the growth imperative that drives intensified commodification as a fix to accommodate capital accumulation does have fundamental consequences for the natural environment, though, which is the second key cross-cutting theme. So the declines in the fish resources in Southeast Asia that I touched on earlier are mirrored by broader processes of coastal and marine ecosystem degradation. So for example, between 2000 and 2012, more than 100,000 hectares of mangroves were lost in Southeast Asia. Pollution is a major problem. Sources range from plastic and solid waste to discharges from coastal tourism developments, agriculture, factories and oil spills. Southeast Asia's coral reefs are considered in a recent assessment as globally the most threatened. Climate change is, of course, expected to worsen these challenges. Coral bleaching is a central threat to coral reefs in Southeast Asia that generate coral reef fisheries, as are the related issues of variable sea levels, storms, and ocean acidification. And climate change is, of course, already contributing to changes in coastal livelihoods in Southeast Asia. For example, Cyclone Nargis in 2008 left over 138,000 people dead in the Irrawaddy Delta, while Typhoon Haiyan in 2014 also highlighted the vulnerability of small-scale fishers to extreme weather events. And so across all sectors of society, the livelihoods of small-scale fishers are becoming exposed to greater levels of environmental risk. The third key cross-cutting theme is the idea of coastal squeeze. So as I touched on earlier, mobility for small-scale fishers has become less flexible due to intensified governance of maritime zones through conservation or through transboundary surveillance, such as between Australia and Indonesia or in the South China Sea. More recently, COVID-19 has obviously impacted mobility also. And coastlines in particular are spaces where land tenure is typically more ambiguous than in many inland areas. And so this means that with increased activities in coastal areas, such as tourism developments, aquaculture and conservation, access to these spaces and resources is becoming subject to particularly intense competition. Many instances of households being evicted from coastal land or otherwise marginalised in relation to new physical developments. And so overall, we can see that a process of increased territorialisation is unfolding across coastal and maritime spaces from multiple origins, resulting in coastal squeeze. And while coastal or ocean grabbing processes are a typical component of coastal squeeze that are sort of well documented, there's all these everyday processes of differentiation related to migration, gender, ethnic identity, and position in the value chain. These are key elements of coastal squeeze, but are often overlooked in accounts that tend to focus on the highly visible large-scale events. And so all of these dynamics of exclusion are intensified in a context of declining resources. So to finish up, as with related processes of agrarian change in Southeast Asia, coastal transitions are certainly not linear. Small-scale fisheries are entangled in multiple drivers of change, some older and more recent. Sorry, I've just got a package at the door. I think I'll just keep on going. While coastal transitions away from capture fisheries have effectively taken place in some locations such as Singapore, in the larger coastal nations, fishing is and will continue to be a major source of income generation. And so despite the emergence of narratives about a so-called more efficient blue economy, small-scale fisheries remain the dominant activity across coastal Southeast Asia that support livelihoods. And I haven't given specific quantifiable numbers here, partly because the numbers for small-scale fisheries are the official statistics are generally completely inaccurate. There's a very large study that should be coming out very, very soon that is basically hoping to fix that for small-scale fisheries around the world. Particularly in times of shock and vulnerabilities such as COVID-19, small-scale fisheries persists as part of wider livelihood portfolios that can be drawn on in the context of precarious living. Frequently, diversification and occupational multiplicity over time and within households is the result. Diversification can sometimes reflect distress and precarity, while under other circumstances, it can reduce vulnerability for a household. So while the diversity of coastal transitions has led to varying levels of success for small-scale fishers engaging in them, the broader context that we point to of intensifying commodification, widespread environmental degradation and coastal squeeze together comprise a setting of heightened pressure on livelihood activities that compound people's vulnerability. Small-scale fishers negotiate new livelihood opportunities, but increasingly within the constraints set by these broader structural processes. And an important feature of these processes is their mutually reinforcing nature. So the growth imperative that drives commodification leads to unsustainable resource extraction and the movement of diverse and contested interest groups to coastal spaces. We can see many examples of counter-narratives, such as the United Nations International Small-Scale Fisheries Guidelines, movements for blue justice in civil society, and so on. However, we argue that without more fundamental changes to the pathways of imminent development characterised by the intensification of commodification, environmental decline, and coastal squeeze, small-scale fishing livelihoods will experience increased vulnerability. And just one tiny more thing, a plug for a book if you're interested in these issues around fishing livelihoods. A book I've co-authored with Kate Barclay will be coming out hopefully very soon in the next month or so, and it'll be free and open access. So that's my plug. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Mike, and congratulations on the upcoming book. That's very exciting. Just like to invite everyone else to join me in thanking Mike using the clapping icon.
Thanks.
For the reactions. Look, so much going on and happening in this area. I'd like to open it up now to questions. Before we get started, I'll just remind people who have arrived that these talks are recorded and that recording does go up on YouTube. So I'd like to invite you to feel free to ask questions, but if you don't want to be recorded, please put them in the chat and I can ask them for you. And if you'd like to ask a question, please raise hand. You can go to the reaction button and then there's the raise hand button. So thank you, everyone. Does anyone have a question following up from that talk? I might start with one. You mentioned, Mike, this ocean and coastal grabbing phenomenon. Could you expand a bit more on how it's different from the land grabbing that we might be a bit more familiar with, or what makes it so ambiguous?
Sure. So I guess it's not necessarily fundamentally different to land grabbing processes in that, you know, in some ways it's a, you know, a label on a similar sort of process. So ocean grabbing can be, for example, a marine park through conservation, or it can be through an offshore oil and gas development and so on. With coastal spaces, though, I guess, yeah, it's interesting to document the amount of coastal grabbing that is taking place. So it's the same basic process in that it can be private or public sector actors that come in and make claims on spaces that push aside less powerful claims. But in coastal spaces, you're really seeing a sort of a dramatic uptick of interest and investment. So, you know, we've got there's this nebulous thing called the blue economy at the moment going on, which has many various contested definitions, but sort of one general thing, what we're seeing is just a massive increase in interest and investment by everyone from policymakers to non-government organisations to private sector actors and so on. And when all of this money sloshing around and attention sloshing around becomes focused on coastlines, coastlines are, yeah, as I mentioned, typically places where land tenure isn't particularly well defined in a lot of maritime Southeast Asia. So often that's because fishers might have been migrants from 20 or 30 years ago and may have settled along beachfront areas, which in many countries, for example, in the Philippines, it's still technically regarded as public land. And so you'll have people who will have been there for 30 years or 40 years, however, they don't necessarily have formal land title over it. And so then you get a mall coming in or a tourism development coming in and channeling lots of money and resources in there, and you know, lots of tourists coming in and wanting to enjoy it. And yeah, small scale fishers tend to not be the ones whose claims are privileged, or within the groups of small scale fishers, it can often be the ones with less access to social capital. So, for example, more recent migrants who may have less strong social connections and so on in these places.
It sounds like there's a lot of different points of pressure there with marginalised people, ambiguous land tenure, very limited resource in terms of, you know, coastal area. It's not getting any bigger, and this interest in the blue economy. I see we have a question in the chat. So the question coming through is, Mike, are there any rays of hope? Great question.
Any rays of hope? Yeah, no, sorry, that was a pretty grim presentation, really, wasn't it? Sorry.
Sometimes things are grim, so this is life.
Yeah, I mean, no, I mean, I guess I wanted to hint at least, you know, there are these other counter narratives and processes going on. So I guess, yes, there certainly are. So, for example, across civil society, there's, you know, even in the idea of the blue economy is a highly contested concept. On the one hand, you've got actors that are pushing for full-scale industrializations of the oceans, turn the oceans into a gigantic fish farm and an oil quarry or whatever. But on the other hand, you've got, you know, voices that are banding together to push for more rights for vulnerable groups such as small-scale fishers and so on. There's points of contention. So yeah, and then, you know, people are latching onto, you know, global instruments such as these small-scale fisher guidelines for small-scale fisheries, which were a really major achievement that sort of got pushed through the UN. They're voluntary guidelines, however, it was sort of something that a lot of countries around the world are now sort of, at least rhetorically, starting to sign up to. So that's sort of one sort of concrete thing in the policy institutional space that people are happy about. I guess partly, though, the reason for my sort of fairly bleak emphasis was because I guess I get frustrated sometimes by what I see as a bit of an overwhelming emphasis on technocratic solutions still in the policy space, whether that's university researchers who come up with the latest framework, or whether that's donor agencies that come up, you know, with the latest technology or the latest model for implementation or something. And I mean, this isn't necessarily the most profound insight, but, you know, all of these things, they bump up against these hard political realities and the underlying structural processes that drive livelihood change in the area is not the latest framework by an academic or a civil society or policymakers. It's these more fundamental processes of, yeah, environmental degradation, coastal squeeze, commodification, and so on. And so without necessarily saying that I've got a better idea of how to fix things, these are profound problems. I guess I just wanted to put a bit of a focus for the audience that I was speaking to for this particular piece. It's gone to a journal. And yeah, to put a bit more of a focus to policymakers to get their attention to think about some of these more structural processes, I guess. It was a bit of a rambling answer. So
you did mention at the end of your talk the need for fundamental change. Can I draw you out a little bit more about what that could look like, or what would facilitate that? What would enable that?
Yeah, I mean, that's the $1 million question, I suppose. So
sorry, just a tricky one.
No, I mean, it's the classic sort of critical social science dilemma of we're always very good at pointing out what's going wrong, but coming up with constructive solutions is the challenging part. And I agree, it's not straightforward, and you know, but it's not necessarily you know, always up to small scale fishers or the people who work in these countries. You know, I can only you know, point to the example of climate change, for example, where, you know, Cambodia or the Philippines, they're not the ones who should be asked to drive the agenda on climate change. It's countries like Australia, for example. And I mean, I don't know whether, you know, Australian aid agencies need to, or, you know, donor agencies more generally need to think more seriously about, yeah, the sorts of technical support they provide and in what contexts they provide them. Yeah.
Thank you. Also, in the chat, I see there is a question from Sango about methodology. Sango, would you like to ask that, or did you want me to ask it for?
I can ask it.
Yeah,
I just put it in there so I didn't forget. Thanks, Mike. That was really interesting. As I've mentioned in my chat note there, I'm interested in the methodology and how your team was able to bring together findings across so many countries, and I guess different coastal and marine areas. Yeah, just a little bit more on that would be great. And I've been part of a similar process recently looking at crop booms.
Okay.
But that was a little bit more concentrated in terms of geographic area. We were focusing on mainland Southeast Asia. So I'm curious to know more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Sango. I mean, yeah, to be honest, your last point in the chat about being quite challenging, yeah, I totally get this has been a very tricky paper to lead simply because of the potential vast, yeah, it's been a challenge to narrow it down to what are we talking about and what are we focusing on. So, I mean, very briefly, we had like a main working group within the larger group. So there was a 3 or 4 of us who basically coordinated and led the whole thing, and we structured a sort of a standard template for all participants to fill out and provide information about all the sorts of maritime zone developments that were affecting small-scale fisheries that had been well documented in the secondary literature. So there was no primary data collection. And yeah, one of the key things we tried to get was some level of expertise across all Southeast Asian countries. So each person initially was tasked, or sometimes two people, sometimes three people were tasked with particular countries, and then a lot of people had some expertise in multiple countries, and so we then basically got all of that information and then tried to do a basic analysis of what are the main themes that emerged. So it's a critical review. It wasn't a comprehensive with a formal protocol and so on. It was essentially a critical review where we each sort of reviewed each other's work and slowly built up something coherent from there. So I hope that.
Great. Thanks so much for telling us a bit more about that process. Would other people here today like to ask another question? Feel free to just unmute yourself or to put it in the chat. We've got quite a quiet group today. Michael, you've got the book coming up. What are the next steps for you in this area?
So with this one in particular, hoping to, this specific thing, hoping to get it published at some point. So we submitted it to a journal not that long ago and hoping to publish it. This is sort of one of the last things that I've been doing on a project looking at the blue economy. So yeah, the emergence of all of this attention focused on coastal and marine spaces and what it means for local coastal residents. So this is sort of one of the final pieces of work to come out of that. And then I suppose other things I'm sort of working on relatedly in this space is, I suppose, sort of responding to Sarah's earlier comment about rays of hope. I'm sort of becoming more and more interested in more applied projects. So working a lot with Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, and to try and basically, I suppose, put it bluntly, put my money where my mouth is and sort of put, my skin in the game in terms of actually trying to see if I can produce some more practical suggestions for how to go about things, basically, by shifting to a more applied focus. So that's increasingly an interest of mine.
Well, that sounds like an exciting change, and certainly it is a challenge for people who are working in the academic space to, feel like we are having impact in the world, and to at times, and to work on these pathways for hope, and what is the practical solution, what can we as individuals do. So good luck on the next steps.
Thank you.
Is there anything else that you would like to say today on this topic?
Oh, I think I'm all good. No, thank you. Thanks very much for organising and hosting, Kat, and thanks everyone for coming along, and hopefully, yeah, be able to catch up with, some or most of you at some point with a coffee in face